But if we look at the authentication is enabled requirement, then we could see that this is like a branch, right? If authentication is enabled, then do something else. So for that reason, we could think of it as, so there's two ways to look at this, right? We could think of this as two separate queries where this if authentication is enabled branch is like saying, okay, when a client connection is received and it's in the whitelist, then perform this operation with this subscription side effect. And then a separate observable that says when a client's connection is received and it's whitelisted, then just perform this subscription side effect directly. Then there will be some duplication, though, in that case, of the subscription side effect, right? We'd have to have two places where we call subscribe and do the same thing. That might not be so bad if we're just calling a method or doing something very simple, but it's still duplication, right? And obviously in the worst case is you're doing something that requires a lot of state and it's not as simple as just calling a separate method. You have to prepare something or type first or something like that. Then duplicating it would be, I'm not saying we have to do that, by the way. I'm just saying in theory, when something like that happens, the duplication is really harmful to your code, right? It's not as clean and as maintainable as you'd like it, probably. So the question is there another way to do this where if you notice a branch here, is there a way we could take this initial observable and then branch it to do one thing if necessary, and then sort of join them back again to perform the final subscription side effect? And the answer, of course, is yes. So how do you do that, though? How do you do this this separation? Well, if we think of it as, if we go take a step back, right? Because I want you to think reactively here. If we take a step back and we think of this as an observable of whitelisted clients, then we could think of it as two separate observables where one of them does some additional processing, right? Maybe some side effects, but everything's asynchronous, right? We're awaiting responses and so on. So it's still asynchronous. It's still an iObservable that produces some output, which is essentially the same as the output if we didn't do this at all. And then a subscription side effect happens. Now, because we're representing this as an iObservable, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling up and down a lot again. Because we're representing this as an iObservable, there's something wrong with every time I try to move this. See, look, it's not taking. I'm holding the mouse down and it just won't let me move this. There we go. It has something to do with, I think, this editor. I feel like, well, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it has. You see, look, it's not letting me move it up again. Yeah. I don't know. It's been like this, not just for this video, but for several videos now. So sorry, I'm venting a little bit about it, but it's been very annoying. Every time I try to do that, I don't know what the problem is. Maybe I'll try to get down to the bottom of it outside of the video series. But anyway, I apologize for that distraction there. So back to what I was saying. The point is that if we have an iObservable here as input, and so let's call this observable A. Then we have another observable which just adds some stuff to the original one. We'll call that B. Then we could just pretend, because it doesn't really matter in this case, we could pretend that they have completely different sources. So it doesn't matter if A and B share the same source. Let's imagine for a moment that they're completely different observables. You have A and you have B, and they don't share anything in common at all. They're completely different, except you want to cause subscription side effects in both of them when either of them produce a value. Okay? So you have two completely separate observables, but the same side effect when you subscribe to each. And you don't want to have to call subscribe twice on both of them, or once on each one, I should say. So twice in total. Instead, you want to call subscribe once. Well, then how do you combine the two observables in such a way that you could call subscribe only once? I'm going to try to move this back up again. It worked. All right, good. So the answer is a very simple operator, as you might imagine. That's the beauty of RX, right? A lot of these things that might seem complicated at first end up being a single operator that's very easy to use once you learn how to use it, perhaps. But the solution to this problem is an operator called merge, right? So we have one observable A and another observable B. the merge operator will allow us to create a new observable that will generate notifications whenever either of the input observables notify. Okay, so if A pushes a client, then a client will go to the output. If B pushes a client, then a client will go to the output. And the output observable is just another observable. We could just subscribe to it directly, but we could also write a query on top of that if we wanted to. So how would we represent that here? Well, we need two observables, right? So why don't we grab this one here, which is essentially the, let's say we'll have two of them, right? Authenticated are the clients that are authenticated. And, oh, actually, I just realized I might not be doing this. I don't really have to do it this way. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why. It just dawned on me that this if block is not based on the data coming into the observable. I was all excited that we were going to get to use a merge. All right, we'll just have to hold off on that. You know what? Maybe I'll continue just to show you what I would have done. No, I don't want to. That's that's too bad, actually. I don't want to do that. I think that would just be a distraction, maybe. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if this was going to be something that was useful and turned out that I just misread the spec, my own spec. I was too excited to do something more interesting than what we've been doing. So, you know what? I am going to finish it anyway. The thought this will maybe go into the highlight, even though it doesn't actually implement the spec. So I'm going to end up undoing this code and then implementing it the way I really should. So this is what I'm thinking. Let me explain myself here. In case you didn't notice, you probably noticed it before me and thought, "What the hell is he doing?" But if authentication is enabled, is a flag that's like external to this query, right? It's just, what is the state of the application? Are we authenticating or are we not? It has nothing to do with the data that's coming into the observable. So for that reason, it means that we're only choosing one query or the other and then subscribing to it. So we don't have to do anything really tricky there. We just have to say, check some Boolean from some state somewhere, some configuration property or something. If authentication is enabled, then this is the query we're going to generate on top of the whitelisted query. Otherwise, we're just not going to add this query to it, and we're just going to subscribe directly. So this is a nice thing to implement anyway. I'll do that now just because that's useful. I'll do it in a moment. But I just want to finish the thought for the merge because I got really close to the end of it, and I think it's a nice thing to know about if you're not familiar with it. So, sorry for jumping around so much here. This is what happens when you don't plan, right? So on the left side of our so let's look at it as we have two observables, two separate observables, right? We have this authenticated observable and this unauthenticated observable. So this is what made me notice that I obviously misunderstood the spec because this doesn't quite make sense, right? Why would we ever allow unauthenticated observable notifications? Well, we would if we don't need authentication to be enabled. But okay, so anyway, if we ignore the spec for a moment here, the general idea is that we have two separate observables and we want to merge them in some way. So what we would do here is we could start by defining the base query that they're going to be glued to. In this case, the expectation was that they'd have the same source. Both queries would be based on top of the same subquery, if you will, or source query, I guess would be a better way to describe it. But that's not necessarily required. Obviously, you could have two completely separate observables. As long as they have the same data type, you could merge them using the merge operator. So in our case, we wanted to, in my misunderstanding, base them off the same query. Now, because we want to base them off the same query, it means we have to do a publish again, right? So it would have been something like this. It would have been, let's say, whitelisted equals this, although we'd publish it. Oh, well, okay, so this is actually a little bit better. We don't have to republish the where clause for whitelisting, right? We could just repeat that if we wanted to. That's probably not too bad if we just repeated that. The publish is costly. You don't want to have a lot of publishes everywhere. We want to avoid them if we can, as a matter of fact. You don't want to just throw them in everywhere. So in our case, I think it would be cheaper to just have a separate where check here in both queries. So let's do it that way. So we're going to have a where whitelisted in both cases. And then for the authenticated one, you might say something like from, authenticated or auth or whatever in do auth async, something like that. And you pass in the client. And then, so this would actually compile into a select many query with a where clause attached to the input. Two froms, consecutive froms compile into a select many query. So we could just use the select many operator directly in the fluent method syntax, but I like this syntax better. I think it reads nice. It also keeps our variables in scope all the way to the bottom of the query. We don't have to create our own types or tuples or anything like that. The compiler just does that for us, so it's a nice little syntax that makes our lives a little easier. And I find it easier to read, but perhaps that's a little subjective. So anyway, so we have our select many, which is sequential composition. First do this line. It's almost like imperative style code, right? First read this line, and when a client comes in, then do this line, which is, do auth async. Then when auth comes in, now we have auth in scope and C in scope, the client pair in scope. And we could do a projection. We could continue the query with another from if we wanted sequentially, whatever we want to do. So in our case here, we'd probably say, let's just return the client, because once auth is completed, we could throw away any data that was or state that was required in order to perform that operation. We know they're authenticated now, maybe even enhance the client object to capture any state we need or something, and then just project the client. Remember, the data types are going to have to be the same if we want to use the merge operator. So we'll just project the client the way we normally would. In the unauthenticated case, it's just we don't even have to do this step here. That's the only difference, and just project the client. And now that we have these two observables, we would just simply say, go down here. So what is it? Authenticated and unauthenticated, right? So we would say authenticated.merge with unauthenticated. And then we could just call subscribe directly on that. We don't even need this extra parens. It doesn't like this for some reason because I'm not getting IntelliSense unmerge, unless Visual Studio is just behaving badly again. So it sees this is an observable of client. It sees this. Oh, it doesn't know what authenticated is. Oh, because of this, right? Sorry, my bad. So we could just represent this as, just for the sake of example here, auth could just return an observable of. Oops. I'm not going to actually execute this code, so it doesn't really matter. So we'll use unit. We've already seen unit before, so I won't explain it again. Just think of it as like a void that actually has, that represents a single placeholder, if you will. So now it should understand what this is. It's an observable of client. Yep, T is client. And now our merge operator works. There we go. So merge has another overload. Actually, merge, I think, has... Oh, so I think there's other overloads in some custom operators I've built, but in the official RX, you can see that there's two overloads. The first one just takes a second client, and the second one allows us to also pass in a scheduler. There's another merge operator, though, called observable.merge. Oh, we haven't even talked about schedulers yet, but I don't think this is an appropriate time, so we'll defer that talk to the future as well, but schedulers are pretty important thing in RX, so we'll get to them eventually. But you'll see if you just call observable.merge directly, there's a whole bunch of overloads, 11 actually, and they do a bunch of things that I'm not going to get into, but you'll see that if you go through these, there's a lot of cool stuff you could do. This is, in particular, this overload with max concurrent is pretty useful. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that in your own time. I don't know that we'll ever be getting to those overloads in this application, but it just gives you an idea of the breadth of possibilities in operators like merge, and many operators throughout RX have many overloads that do various things. So, very subtle differences between each overload. So it's worth, if I teach you an operator, it's worth looking at the other overloads yourself and seeing what else is available in your own time. Okay, so again, like I promised, we're going to have to delete this because it doesn't really implement the spec, but hopefully this was a nice little explanation of the merge operator, and it's something you understand now. If not, of course, I'd be happy to take questions, by the way. So if anything's unclear, feel free to ask questions, and I'll try to address them in subsequent videos.